Welcome. I'm Michael Gilligan. I'm the Chief Common Ground Officer at Seek Common Ground. Welcome to our Learning Community Talk, Participatory Action Research, Shifting from Deficit to Asset Framing. Joining us today are Daniela DiGiacomo, Assistant Professor at the University of Kentucky College of Communication and Information, and an affiliated researcher at the Civic Engagement Research Group. Daniela works with a close partner of Seek Common Ground, the Kentucky Student Voice Team. We're also being joined by Joel Daniel Harris, who's the executive dreamer of TomTod Ideas, which serves middle schoolers in Northeast Ohio, and who participated in our Ohio Whole Child Action Accelerator. You can learn more about Daniela and JD by clicking on their bios in the chat. Today, they're joining us to share their perspectives and experience in research and evaluation of notably youth serving programs. Our learning community, the members of which have expressed their interest in this complex subject area. So we're excited to have two extremely thoughtful people on to share their insights. Just by the way, I have an expressive aphasia, which is an after effect of my hemorrhagic stroke suffered earlier this year. So I speak slowly and carefully, and occasionally have some trouble getting the right words out. So bear with me. For our talk today, Daniela and JD will discuss their work for about 20 minutes. Then we'll have a discussant join for 20 minutes. Finally, to round out the hour, we'll stop recording and invite those joining us live to have an off-the-record discussion. Like all of our talks, today's session will be available on our YouTube channel within a week of the live session. And our discussant today is Rachel Belin. She's the managing partner at the Kentucky Student Voice Team, and her role will be to reflect on Daniela and JD's discussion and ask them some questions. And also, by the way, throughout the talk, we encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A function. So now to get down to business. Daniela and JD, you approach today's topic from different vantage points, but have similar perspectives. To start off, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do and the role research practices can play to improve programs? I'll hand it over to you first, Daniela.
Great, thanks, Michael. Can everyone hear me okay? Cool. Well, thank you, Michael and Seek Common Ground. It's a pleasure to be here. Again, my name is Daniela, and this is my fourth year as an assistant professor at University of Kentucky. And broadly speaking, my research sort of area of interest over the last 4 years and then long before this is inequality and how inequality is produced through both micro social interactions and through broader public social institutions. And that interest has started early on before formal schooling experiences, continued with me and prompted me to pursue professional and academic careers and pursuits of study within Latin American studies and international development and social work, and then finally in education, where I've landed. And so as a learning scientist, what I study and focus on is how we can design learning environments, both in and out of school, for more equitable ends. Because I think that I still believe that through public education, even though it's not doing this often in its current form, can serve to enhance opportunity and enhance different different types of social mobility. And I think in many ways we fall short, but I've been particularly compelled to the out of school space, because I think in that space, we have a little bit more room to push. And, young people only spend 8 hours in the schools, and the rest of the days the rest of their time, they're also learning. And so I've become really curious about how we can support sort of lifelong, life-wide, life deep learning. And so I'll just say just a little bit more that with that interest and guiding interest, my work even though it's housed in the university, is really driven by this notion of community-based research. And that takes different forms, but broadly speaking, what it looks like is that I sort of start my guiding inquiry or interest in the communities in which I'm working. So rather than, my intellectual interest coming necessarily from more academic concerns, it tends to be grounded within and from the community. And so sometimes that's been in school districts, sometimes that's been in youth organizations. But what it looks like is that the sort of driving problem of practice sort of originates, and then the solution ultimately, or what we're working on eventually and hopefully feeds back into the communities themselves, because they're co-designers in all of the stages of the work. So I feel like I've been talking a little bit, so I'm going to pause there. But yeah, that's a little bit about me.
That's a great intro. I'm going to hand it over to Joel Daniel.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Daniela. I'm really excited to be in this conversation with you today, and for all the experiences you bring to the table. So I'm the executive dreamer at TomTod Ideas, and TomTod stands for Tomorrow's Idea Today. Ideas today. I'm neither Tom nor Todd. They do not exist. And we work exclusively with middle schoolers. We think that middle schoolers bring an audacious, empathetic, passionate voice to the table. And too often that voice is excluded or ignored, and sort of overlaid with perceptions of awkwardness, or just wait until you get older and then you can do something that matters. But what we're convinced of is that middle schoolers can do real things that matter right now, starting today. They don't have to wait until tomorrow. That being said, while they're doing real meaningful things in their communities today, they can learn the skills that will help set them up for success both today and tomorrow. So we do school-based programming during the school day in partnership with public school districts. We do after-school programming as well. And we do summer enrichment programming. And so we're engaged with middle schoolers sort of throughout all those different kinds of environments, both affiliated with public schools and then also out in the broader community. And the shape of our programming looks like engaging middle schoolers in exploring their communities, and then responding to the assets and challenges that they see in their communities, coming up with ideas, and looking for ways to put those ideas into motion in real time. So the topic of today's discussion, and what really connects deeply to me, is that as an organization that works with middle schoolers, we want to make sure that our programming is effective. And so we want to evaluate it. We want to be able to show clear and exciting outcomes to our funders, to the general public, and to create great outcomes for middle schoolers, because all of our programming ultimately is focused on them. But how do we do that in a way that is meaningful and that is developmentally targeted and appropriate, and isn't just making numbers up for the sake of having fancy numbers, which is what sometimes evaluation can feel like, right? Is making sure that we're hitting targets, but are we hitting the right targets, and how do we choose what the right targets are? And like you were saying, Daniela, how do we even include our audience as co-designers of those targets, and not just the perception of what we want middle schoolers to be or want them to become, but how are youth involved in creating their own futures and evaluating the success or struggles towards that. So all that to say, you've probably picked up on this, but we have a very positive viewpoint of middle schoolers. We think that they're incredible. We think adolescence as a whole, that it's a life stage of possibility, not a life stage to be solved, if that makes sense. So when I was getting to know you a little bit, Daniela, and if I could just throw a question back your direction, I was really struck, and you mentioned this in your introduction as well, by your desire to pursue how do we lessen inequality in public institutions and in social spaces. And so I think a lot of times people could connect the dots on what that means, and in terms of making certain types of experiences available to a broader audience, or doing that in tangible programmatic ways. But I wanted to hear more about, what does it look, how do observation and evaluation interact with continuing or disrupting inequality? Like, how does the actual evaluative practice continue inequality? How does it disrupt inequality? What have been some of your observations and discoveries along the way?
This is not an easy question, Joel Daniel. This is
Sorry.
like the question. Yeah, it's a great one. So I think part of our ongoing challenge is that a lot of the work that happens in these after school, out of school time spaces is deeply socio and relational. And I've come to be sort of convinced that what counts is very hard to be counted, and I think that there's a lot of work in the education research field broadly, by Tony Brike and improvement science, that, you can only improve what you can measure. And I think that sort of makes sense from one vantage point, but at the same time, we aren't doing well as a society to improve upon the equitable and consistent provision of opportunity for everyone. In fact, we know that, in the after school landscape, that remains extremely inequitable in terms of consistent access to an opportunity, because of financial reasons, because of transportation reasons, because of all sorts of familial responsibilities. And so I think what I've become curious about is, or continually working on, is thinking about, okay, if the really good learning that is consequential, the learning that happens that changes young people's orientations to either the world around them or a particular content area, or that is particularly transformative in terms of their identity development, if that happens through a particular type of relational pedagogy between adults and young people, so whether that looks like particular type of youth adult partnerships or side-by-side learning, how can we basically break down or backwards design that sort of relational pedagogy in a way that can be measured, counted, and shown, both for the training and organization of those programs, and as an effect in the short term and long term on what's working. And I think typically as you mentioned, we measure the success of after school programming, or like side by after school, out of school, or before school program. We tend to measure it in terms of like reduced delinquency or increased academics. And for me, I think all those things happen alongside the rest, but the way we push against, I think, inequality is taking seriously the ways in which young people in these spaces, especially those from marginalized, minoritized communities, and especially those in communities where their teachers and mentors don't look like them, which is also often the case in the US educational system, both in and outside of school, is when they feel empowered to exercise the voice and the power that they do have, and to pursue the lives that they have reason to value. Because as you said, like, they have that interest and expertise and agency, but often we keep them down or we sort of stratify and track. But something's going on in these after school programs often where the young person recognizes and pushes back on the system that's pushing on them, and is able, I think, to pursue the life that they have reason to value. And so I'm curious about how we can break down and measure that, for lack of a better word, relational pedagogy.
That's great. It
So,
strikes me.
I wanted to pick up on the thread that Daniela was laying out and ask you a question, Joel, Daniel, in that you're engaging middle schoolers as researchers, as participants in the research, in developing their own programming. What led you to that, and how do you practice it?
So I think what led me to it was getting to know middle schoolers as humans and not as targets of programming, right? And that understanding them as humans then, and seeing their passions, seeing their skills and abilities, and seeing that they had a desire to make real impact, not some imagined day in the future, but some real impact right now. Then how do we create the space for that to happen? And then how do we continue at scale to make sure that that's happening? So it's one thing for me to be able to look at the relationships that I have with middle schoolers and assess, am I empowering them? Am I holding them back? Am I enabling certain approaches, et cetera? It's another thing to create a programmatic design that says, you know, now we're able to do this in a larger manner or fashion across many leaders, across many districts, across, you know, many students. And so how do we reflect on that? One of the things that strikes me about what you're saying, Daniela, is I think sometimes that we confuse the symptoms and the substance, and we end up measuring symptoms instead of substance. So we measure things like attendance, and we measure things like certain types of engagement, when really it's what we want is not a kid showing up somewhere. We want a kid, when they show up, being able to meaningfully engage with what they're showing up to, right? Like we want them to be able to be thinking critically about the material that they're working through, to be able to have a curious mindset, to be able to have eyes of wonder and discovery into their surroundings, and that those are the life attributes. Like we're looking for life attributes, but to get to those life attributes, it feels like too often we end up measuring things that are very surfacey, if you will, and therein lies the rub, right? Of what's measurable and what's and maybe what's not. But a big part of our approach at TomTod, as we've tried to explore it, is how do we shift from a engagement with evaluation that shifts from documentation to it's a developmental approach. Like the evaluation itself is actually developmental, not an after reflection.
How are you, I mean, can I push you a little bit to say, how are you doing that in practice?
Yeah, for sure. Well, some of it is, I think there's some of it is a mindset shift, and I'll try to be brief because I know we want to bring Rachel in and engage her in this too, because the work she's doing through KSP is so reflective of this. But it's a mindset shift organizationally. How do we reflect that? That are we explaining the evaluation that we're doing? Are we engaging students in understanding the evaluation and not just sort of laying it on them, if you will, so that evaluation is actually like they're going to learn to think abstractly, that they're understanding that this self-reflection process is an abstract thinking piece. Another part of it is how do we engage students in so that the evaluation isn't a separate piece, it's not pulled out, but that it's integrated. And so then how can we remove, like, make sure that it's developmentally aligned and that their perception of what's happening to them in evaluation is developmentally appropriate. Those are sort of two quick elements that I would point to, and I'll throw it back to you, Michael, and you can bring Rachel in.
Yeah, you are both having such an engaging dialogue, but let's bring Rachel into the circle. As you know, Rachel is the managing partner at Kentucky Student Voice Team, and she's been a long time collaborator with Seek Common Ground. Currently, she's an advisor to our Student Action Network for Equity. And she and the Kentucky Student Voice team have participated in several of our action accelerators. So first off, Rachel, what are your thoughts on the discussion so far? And then feel free to ask JD and Daniela questions.
Thanks. Thank you for the kind handoff, Michael. First of all, it's really nice to be here with both of you, Jill, Daniel, and Daniela. Although I'm called a discussant, I feel much more like a stenographer because I'm literally writing everything you say down, not just because I'm the discussant, but because I'm deeply in it and fascinated by everything you're saying. So just a housekeeping note to our live audience. If you'll please just pose your questions in the Q&A function, we'll get to them in our discussion or in the off the record discussion to follow. So with that said, really so many things you both were saying resonates so much with me. I start a few things. One of them was the notion that what counts is hard to be counted. And the irony of that phrase when we're talking about especially measuring like educational impacts in a school where literally nothing matters unless it counts, and everything that we value about students shows up as a GPA with to the 100th decimal power. And that's what's valued in a school system. So I wonder if you can talk, both of you, Joel, Daniel, and Daniela, I'd be really interested to know about what I call creative metrics. What are some other metrics that you've seen or that you've used yourself that help us capture the awesomeness of what we're trying to measure, or the challenges too? I'd love to hear about that.
I can jump in and give one quick example, and then which also maybe guys, I think I was still staying in ambiguity land in answer to Danielle's earlier question. So I'll try and give a real concrete example. We use one approach to our evaluation is that we have students engaged in what we call a walkie-talkie process, and that so they get up around and they walk around the room and they engage with different prompts, evaluate, looking at their community, and they document like what do they see as the assets in their community, what do they see as the challenges in their community, what sparks questions in their community. And we use this and they're putting things on sticky notes and they're throwing it in Google Forms and they're rotating around the room and sort of putting it on papers around the wall or on handouts. And so there's an active movement, physical movement piece to it. There's a written piece to it. And then we use this experience multiple times throughout a semester with groups of students. Now, the data isn't connected back to individual students, but it's collected as a whole for the whole classroom or cohort of students. And so what we can then chart is what are the ways that students are talking about their community, and how does that expand over the course of a semester? What are the words that they're using to talk about their community, and how do those change over the course of the semester? So it might show an increase in critical and creative thinking skills, or in like the types of word choice that they're using to describe things around them. But I think it's meaningful that part of that shift for us is a change from an individual measure to a collective measure, and that's what allows us to capture that data in a way that doesn't feel like a test or an evaluation or what you did know about the community, what you now know, but it's like, hey, we view you as experts of your community, and we're sort of observing this and processing through it together and continuing to discover what each other know and learn.
That is so radical. You mean we're all better when we're all better?
No, it's
wow, that's amazing. But also I'm hearing incredible attention and belief in that concept that process is product, especially when it comes to evaluation. Process of learning how and actually doing the evaluation is what we're after as a product itself. Daniela, how about you? Other creative metrics you've seen? You're in and out of schools.
Yeah, I love, Joel, Jenny, what you said, and I'd love to see some of those questions or items down the line too. So when I first started my graduate school experience at University of Colorado Boulder, I was lucky to be part of this research alliance called the Connected Learning Research Network. And I'm still a part of it. It's traditionally been housed between University of California, Irvine and MIT and some universities in between. But it leads with the idea of connected learning, which is learning that happens across spaces. So in schools, out of school, on the digital and that is at once peer supported, civically engaged, academically oriented. So it's a broader emphasis of learning than just the academic or the formal or the disciplinary. And they've done pretty well as a research network that involves both education scholars, information science scholars, sort of a broad psych folks. And it's a research and practice collaborative, and they've done well over the last, now that they've been around nearly 20 years, to design some connected learning measures and evaluation tools. And I just linked to that in the chat. But ultimately, the type of measures that they use, and I'm happy to share and guide any of these, they're all open access, have to do with a lot around asking students during and after their experiences in whatever programs around, do you feel more similar to Jordana? Do you feel more connected to your community? Has this expanded your social network? In what ways? How do you feel like, of course, there's the identity type questions where it's like, how well, to what degree are you interested in pursuing a career in X or Y or Z? So there is the future orientation question, but a lot around the community and empowerment type questions. So, and none of them are academically oriented, right? And so what they do, what they've allowed me to do in the past with teams is support, for example, librarians and library settings and thinking about, hey, is there children or youth setting, or is there makerspace setting, or is the Boys and Girls Club arts room enabling the young people in that space to feel connected to their community, connected to each other, more interested, more engaged, these sorts of metrics. So, and they're pretty usable tools, and they're all there. So I would encourage folks to take a look at those.
I love all of what you both are describing, and it sounds like you're leaning into qualitative metrics more than we usually use in the education system for some reason. I had a conversation earlier today with a student who's doing a lot of research with us, and she was using the word decolonizing to describe the research we do. And I said, that's a really interesting word choice. I wonder what you two think of this, because I said, are we decolonizing, or do we want to talk about the work as democratizing, or both, and to what extent? I'd love to hear your reaction to that language. Decolonizing versus democratizing research.
I can go first. So in education research areas, both have become sort of hot terms. And so I think ideally it's both. It's decolonizing from the perspective of we are working within systems that have served to oppress and marginalize folks of color and low-income folks for a long time. And if we're truly going to move away from that, we have to actively push against it, right? As Ibrahim Kendi and Bonilla Silva say, like, we have to be not just allies, which I know a lot of the Kentucky Student Voice team, when I was on last night with them, they said that they really now, the young people have an issue with the word ally because it's just not enough. And then at the same time, I think many people who look at and talk about democracy, for many people, the US has never been a full and robust democracy. And so I think recognizing that we both have to democratize spaces and research, and also decolonize spaces and research, is something that should be guiding the work we do.
Yes, and it's so interesting to me, like some of the things that Daniela is referring to around decolonization, democratizing in research are not as areas that I'm as familiar with, but where I feel strong alignment with what she's describing is how do we engage, particularly as it applies to youth, how do we engage youth voice in not just elevating their abilities and celebrating them as assets in our communities, but how do we engage youth voice in the design of the evaluation itself, which sort of gets to that point of and so that evaluation isn't just something that's done to youth, to middle schoolers, but it's done with them. And even the self-evaluation is done with them. Like those systems that we're using to evaluate youth are also co-created with them, and that we see that as a learning process, right? So it's not a I think one of my observations and one of my frustrations over the years through our work, and as we were asked to do evaluative work and then recommendations were made to us about how to do that, is that it felt like a lot of the suggestions were not developmentally aligned or appropriate, or they were designed by adults for use on other adults. And so is a middle schooler, an early adolescent, at a state where they can self-reflect? Well, sure, but they're also learning how to self-reflect. So how do we build that understanding into, so if we do a pre-post survey, is that a fair thing to ask a middle schooler to do? Is just well, yeah, you're gonna do a pre and then you're going to reflect on what you learned. Well, but have they been trained what that reflection means? And so how do we build all of that into? So I don't know if Danielle, if you or Rachel, I mean, both of you have experience in what that looks like too, would want to sort of respond to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, we at the Kentucky Student Voice team, Daniela is a consultant and has been for years for us. She's part of our research advisory dream team, and we're really testing, can you teach these basic skills so that young people have the capacity to innovate and to co-design, robustly co-design, not only evaluations of our own programming internally, but an evaluation of the school system in Kentucky externally. And we just did these 2 statewide studies, coping with COVID and Race to Learn. Both of them drew over 10,000 responses from every Kentucky county. They were qualitative and quantitative. The first one was IRB approved with Daniela's help, super rigorous, super academic, still going on, presented to academic audiences as well as policymakers. The second one, we made a decision because it was focused on a lot of things going on in our legislature around conversations about race in the classroom. We made a decision that it shouldn't be IRB approved and it shouldn't be as academic, that lay people and the general public was our first audience. That did not require the same skill set, but it also allowed newer people into the work. So we are always debating that. Sometimes the barrier can be too high if it's a certain kind of research and evaluation that you're trying to code switch and communicate with a certain audience, that can leave young people out, I think. I don't know, Daniela, what are your thoughts? You've seen it all.
Well, no, I mean, I agree. And I'm thinking about it often, this issue of sort of self-selection. And actually, I'll call out one of my grad students, Caitlin, who I think is on the call too. But we were just actually chatting about this in our work with Jefferson County Public Schools and in some partnerships we're doing there, thinking about understanding and trying to improve information literacy, is that from things like student focus groups in classrooms to who will stay at lunch and have pizza with us and talk about their practices, to the Kentucky Student Voice team, where we actually, I think, and Rachel can confirm this, but as a team, we overrepresent in terms of racial and linguistic and ethnic diversity as compared to Kentucky. But where I think we don't have a wide range in terms of diversity is in engagement and achievement. So we have students who are participating that are, I think, appear very racially and linguistically diverse, but not, and geographically diverse. But my guess would be that these are also the high achieving kids. And so you know, I not only want to know about what, for example, the information literacy practices of the kids who stay at lunch are, but I want to know the kids who have their head down and aren't getting up from the desk because of what's going on in their community. So I think we have a real issue here, and I know from I don't think this is unique to this setting or Kentucky. I mean, this is, I think, a persistent problem in social science and educational research for those wanting to take a more qualitative perspective, right?
Yeah. And we have done both. We're running to time to get into overtime, so I'm just going to ask one nugget question. What is the nugget? What if you had a tweet about your big takeaway from the conversation? You can go over 180 characters though. Give us what would you want people to think about, or what are you personally thinking about? What's resonating most with you right now?
Gosh, you all said a bunch of really smart things that strike me. The thing that keeps running around in my head is life is a developmental stage. And so all experiences that we create as educational experiences should be seen as developmental. And so that means how we create the evaluation, so that we're inviting students into that creation process like you're doing at KSV. It means the delivery of the evaluation should be developmental, and then it means that the reflection on the evaluation should be developmental. Like, it all has to be viewed through a developmental lens, and not just as, did we succeed or not? Did we document the program? Did we write something down and create a number?
Yeah, I think that is also quite smart. What's sticking with me from our talk, one of the things is an early mention that Joel Daniel had around seeing middle schoolers, which everyone loves to hate on, as a potential rather than a problematic to be solved. I think if we really, I mean, hence the title of this talk, but if we shifted broadly speaking to seeing diversity as a resource rather than a problem to be solved, and young people as that too, I think we would have some more maybe creative ways to solve some of these persistent problems.
Wow.
Totally tweetable. This is what I was going to say before handing it back to you, Michael. Thanks.
This was great. Great discussion. Thanks to all three of you, and especially to you, Rachel, for doing some heavy lifting and taking the weight off my shoulders. But I do want to ask each of you the same closing question, and I'll turn to you first, Rachel. So who's a real life contemporary hero to you?
So for some reason, I'm thinking a lot about Maria Ressa this week. She was featured in 1,000 Cuts on Frontline, and she won a Nobel Prize fighting and raising a whole generation of young reporters in the Philippines to tell stories about democracy and justice for her journalism outlet. I don't know why that especially resonates now. No, I do know why. I know exactly why in the wake of the midterm. So that's who I'm thinking about right now.
Great. Daniela, same question.
It's going to sound a bit cheesy, but I would say one of my heroes is right now my dad, because he has gone through a lot of different life changes, career-wise and otherwise, and rather than not persisting, he's persisting, and he has an extremely positive attitude about everything, and it's always something I really look up to.
That resonates with me. JD, close us out.
So as I was thinking about this question, honestly, with my contemporary heroes, I'm thinking of my kids who are Everett and Amelie. They're 7 and 5 right now, and they are the two most different kids you can imagine. Like Everett is facts all the time. Her favorite, she tells her school librarian, I want the nonfiction books, please. You know, like she's memorizing, she gets up early to read. And Amelie, life is improv. Like everything is, I'm making up in the moment, I'm going with the flow. And it just really strikes me, like what they remind me together of, because I love them both so dearly, is that is also a reflection of the broader humanity, that people are so different, and that doesn't make different people any less lovable or any like less meaningful in every situation. And so they remind me of the sort of this like broad array of humanity that all need to experience, that they have voice and value in the world. So
Thanks, Jody. So thank you all. And we're going to go to the off the record discussion. And if the people who posed questions can't join us for the overtime, we'll forward the responses to your questions to you. And we'll see you on December 14th at 11 a.m. Eastern time. We'll have a talk on the American Rescue Plan efforts of members of our learning community. It will be hosted by Sandy Boyd, our CEO, and we'll send you an upcoming email invitation. So again, if you can, please join us for the off the record discussion. Otherwise, you can find more SCG Learning Community Talks on our YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us, and have a happy Thanksgiving.